Have you ever been to Japan? For example, in this large, intensively developing city, where skyscrapers grow like mushrooms after rain. Welcome to Hiroshima. What kind of Hiroshima, you ask, because Hiroshima is the same place where a terrible explosion occurred. Okay, here's another Japanese city, Nagasaki. How do you like it? And Nagasaki was also subjected to a nuclear attack. Maybe the modern residents of these cities were deliberately misled and they know nothing about the danger? Maybe we urgently need to inform the Japanese that they live in a zone of deadly radiation? But before calling the Ministry of Emergency Situations, let's remember what we generally know about radiation. These are fairly common properties of matter. The sun is something like a giant hydrogen bomb that emits radiation in a wide range. Ions, as well as gamma radiation, that is, radiation. The force that burned the Earth from the inside and from the so-called core of the Earth may be related to the nuclear decay of heavy transuranium elements. Radiation is emitted by soil, living bodies, and some medications. It turns out that radiation surrounds us everywhere and penetrates our body. Sometimes you can hear the phrase natural radioactive background. Somewhere it is only 15,000ths of a millirentgen per hour, somewhere 10 times more, and it is also considered natural. However, it is more likely that high levels of radioactive radiation in nature are as natural as the natural content of heavy metals in water bodies into which waste products from factories flow. Imagine what will happen if 29 nuclear weapons with a total yield of about 250 megatons are detonated on Russian territory. You will say out loud, this is the end of the world, but how do you react to the official data, according to which, from 1949 to 1963, exactly the same number of nuclear shells bombed the territory of the Soviet Union? Here is the American bomb nicknamed the Baby, which was dropped on Hiroshima on August 9, 1945, and now multiply this bomb by 16,600 times. This is the total power of the strike on the USSR from 49 to 63 of the last century. It's as if the British fired their entire nuclear arsenal of 160 warheads towards an uninhabited area of the Soviet Union. How is this possible? Soviet nuclear tests took place at two of the largest test sites, Semipalatinsk and Novaya Zemlya. For example, the Semipalatinsk test site, which was and is still located in areas quite populated by people. Although logically it should have been located almost at the North Pole or somewhere in Siberia. By the time the first test nuclear bomb exploded, the brand new city of Kharkiv was located some 60 kilometers away. In 1954, another city, Chagin, appeared 80 kilometers from the test site. And imagine that you live in one of these cities, go out onto the balcony to breathe in the fresh morning air, and suddenly there is a flash. What's there? Thunderstorm, your wife will ask. Yes, they are not testing nuclear bombs again. Really, what's wrong with this? And no panic. About 100 atmospheric, that is, non-underground nuclear and thermonuclear charges of varying power, from 1 kiloton to several megatons, with an average frequency of once a month. Even an ultra-small charge of 1 kiloton generates a characteristic nuclear mushroom about 3 kilometers high. And 1 megaton of flue power is 19 kilometers high. What a beauty, what a beauty. Ground-based nuclear explosions at the Semipalatinsk test site had a total yield of about 100 megatons. If all these shells were detonated at the same time, then a square of territory measuring 240 by 240 kilometers would receive a radiation strike with a lethal power of 30 sieverts. For comparison, a person with a dose of only 0.5 sievert is already considered irradiated. It is the fact that the atomic bombs did not all explode at the same time, that many were dosed with time differences, that makes these explosions much less dangerous, including from the point of view of radioactive radiation. Everyone knows from school age that the Earth after a nuclear explosion is not suitable for life and is even deadly. Drinking water from the affected area will also, at a minimum, lead to terrible radiation exposure of the body and genetic changes, and, at a maximum, to painful death. There is even a famous fairy tale about this. But these are all theories, but what in practice? On many continents, here and there you can see huge perfectly round depressions and lakes, suspiciously reminiscent of craters from powerful explosions. For example, here is one of these lakes called Chigan. Since Soviet times, livestock come here to drink, the lake is like a lake. But in fact, this is a real radioactive crater, formed in 1965 as a result of the explosion of a 170 kiloton thermonuclear charge placed in a well 178 meters deep in the bed of the small Chagan River, not far from the Semipalatinsk test site. Radioactive contamination of water in the lake at the end of the 90s was estimated at 300 picocuries/liter, while the maximum permissible level of water contamination based on the total radioactivity of alpha particles is 15 picocuries/liter. However, throughout all these years the lake has been used for watering livestock. For 50 years, no lesions were detected in animals or shepherds. In this case, we can definitely verify the reason for the appearance of a lake of an ideal round shape, which cannot be said about other, seemingly completely natural lakes and craters of the same ideal geometric shape. Just remember the numerous ideal round lakes on the territory of Russia, but these are the sites of a terrible catastrophe. The explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, camera footage from 2017 shows that people are gradually returning to the city. When shops open, you can meet rare passers-by on the streets. Many did not leave these places at all immediately after the explosion. In any case, until the photo shows people with 2 heads, 3 legs, and so on. In general, life goes on. It continues in Japanese cities with a hellish past, Fukushima and Nagasaki. And these cities are much more developed technologically than most Russian cities, which have never been subjected to atomic bombing. As for airborne nuclear explosions from 30 to 50 meters on the ground, in these cases most of the radioactive isotopes are released high into the atmosphere. These microparticles then disperse and pollute a vast space. Sometimes, on a planetary scale. Isotopes generally fall out of the stratosphere only after several years. Therefore, given the weather conditions, it is relatively safe to work at such a site. A colossal portion of heat and dust isotopes released into the upper atmosphere as a result of the explosion of 530 nuclear charges could not but affect the climate and the natural radioactive background. Many of those who saw the 63 years of the last century noted that the winters during that period were warmer and the summer season cooler. Some modern researchers have turned to the study of such a phenomenon as the annual rings of trees, because it was from the 60s that the growth of trees slowed down, which was reflected in the thickness of the annual rings. In 1963, the nuclear powers reached an agreement. Now atomic bomb tests will be carried out only underground. Apparently, the leaders of states have realized how serious the consequences for the climate of such pampering with nuclear weapons. But does this change things much, since the tragedy in Fukushima was provoked by an underground nuclear explosion? In the first half of the 20th century, when radioactivity was little studied, radium and thorium were considered medicinal. They were added to medicine, ointment, cosmetics, such as powder and face cream. From radioactive materials they started producing compressors and even a kind of activator for water. When radium was placed in water at night, and in the morning they drank it, I think that now it is very useful. What will happen to a person if he takes internal small doses of radium-226 and radium-228 mixed with distilled water? You will almost certainly answer that he will not live long, and his death will be painful. Here's an example of a tablet radiator. Only one such baby irradiated a person by about 1 microcurie. Drinking such dietary supplements was considered beneficial, but no mass deaths or sudden radiation illnesses were observed. As they say, everything needs moderation. Meanwhile, the radiator pill became famous for the fact that in 1932 they killed Eben McBurney Byers, an American athlete who drank about 1,400 bottles of this so-called panacea in just 2 years. Having received a dose of radiation 3 times higher than lethal. As a result, after 3 years of taking such pills, he lost all his teeth, part of his jaw, and his bones became incredibly soft. Eventually, after another 2 years, Byers died. And the use of radiation in medicine began with the fact that Henry Cutter determined that cancer cells in the larynx at an early stage can be suppressed by radioactive radiation in a small dose and no side effects will supposedly be observed. This method of treating cancerous tumors was called the Cutter-Arago method, and is still used in medicine. Another illustrative example is the construction of the very first nuclear reactor on the Eurasian continent, F1, under the leadership of the father of the Soviet atomic bomb, Igor Vasilyevich Kurchatov. The room in which the reactor was located, as well as all the personnel, did not have any special protection. But the most interesting thing is that the reactor itself was assembled and disassembled several times by hand in the truest sense of the word. Small cylinders of radioactive metal were inserted into graphite blocks virtually with bare hands, without any special protection. Nuclear physicists will probably say in the comments that F1 was a so-called zero-power reactor, that is, very small powers that do not require cooling, and nuclear fuel in modern nuclear power plants is much more powerful and deadlier. True, there are still eccentrics who walk along it in special protection consisting of only a helmet. So what is radiation? Is it as dangerous as the vast majority believes?